Hello everybody and welcome to Historical Moments. In today's episode we're exploring one of the most misunderstood conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War. For many Americans, the Korean War sits in the shadows between World War II and Vietnam, often called the Forgotten War. But it shouldn't be. It was the first major military clash of the Cold War, the moment where the ideological struggle between democracy and communism turned hot. So, why did the United States send troops halfway across the world to fight in a place few Americans could even locate on a map? What was at stake, and what did leaders in Washington believe they were defending? Let's rewind to the years right after World War II to understand how the Korean Peninsula became a flashpoint for global conflict. When World War II ended in 1945, Korea had endured 35 years of harsh Japanese rule. The defeat of Japan meant liberation, but it also meant a scramble among victorious powers over how to handle the territory Japan had left behind. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allied powers agreed Korea should be temporarily divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviets would accept Japan's surrender in the north, the Americans in the south. What was supposed to be a quick, practical solution soon hardened into a political and ideological divide. In the north, the Soviet Union supported Kim Il-sung, a young, charismatic guerrilla fighter trained in the Soviet army. Under his leadership, North Korea became a communist state aligned with Moscow's vision of socialism. In the south, the US backed Syngman Rhee, fiercely anti-communist and authoritarian, but dependable from Washington's point of view. Both men dreamed of reunifying Korea, but under their own rule. It was only a matter of time before those competing dreams collided. By 1949, the fragile post-war collaboration between the US and the Soviet Union had completely unravelled. The Cold War was underway, an ideological, political and military rivalry that divided the world into two camps. That year brought two shocking developments for the United States. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's brief monopoly on nuclear power. Then, in China, Mao Zedong's Communist Party triumphed over the nationalists, creating the People's Republic of China. In Washington, these events fueled deep anxiety. Many policymakers believed that communism was spreading like wildfire, and that America had to contain it wherever it appeared. This belief became the basis of the Truman Doctrine, which pledged US support for free peoples resisting communist subjugation. So when tensions on the Korean Peninsula escalated, the US saw more than a border dispute. Korea became the next battleground in a worldwide ideological struggle, one that American leaders feared they could not afford to lose. On the early morning of June 5, 1950, the fragile peace shattered. North Korean troops, armed with Soviet tanks and artillery, launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. Within days they captured Seoul, the South Korean capital, and drove South Korean forces, and the small number of American advisors on the ground, into chaotic retreat. The invasion stunned the world. In Washington, President Harry Truman urgently gathered his advisors. For Truman, the attack wasn't just aggression by one small country against another. It was a direct challenge to the post-war order the US had worked so hard to build. A test of America's resolve to stand up to communist expansion. Truman and his team believed that if North Korea succeeded, it would embolden the Soviet Union to push further, perhaps into Europe or towards other key US allies in Asia. The fear of a global domino effect weighed heavily on them. Without waiting for a formal declaration of war, he ordered US air and naval forces to support the defense of South Korea. He also took the issue to the newly formed United Nations, which quickly passed a resolution calling for member nations to repel the invasion. Under this UN banner, the US would soon lead a coalition of 16 nations into battle. So what drove Truman and his administration to intervene so decisively? First, there was the doctrine of containment, the central principle of US foreign policy during the Cold War. Policymakers believed that every act of communist expansion had to be resisted to preserve global balance and protect American influence. If the US failed to confront aggression in Korea, it will signal weakness. Second, Truman wanted to strengthen the United Nations. The UN had been created in the aftermath of World War II to prevent exactly this kind of aggression. A firm collective response in Korea could prove that the UN system worked, that international cooperation could stop future wars. Third, the credibility of the United States was on the line. European nations, especially those in the newly formed NATO alliance, were watching closely. Would America defend freedom or retreat into isolation? Truman worried that hesitation in Korea might undermine faith in US commitments around the world. Finally, there were strategic interests in Asia. The United States had major investments in rebuilding Japan, and a communist-controlled Korea could directly threaten that effort. Stability in East Asia was central to America's post-war plans. Truman explained his decision simply. If aggression went unchecked in Korea, the world would face a Third World War just as surely as we are here today. US troops landed in Korea in July 1950 under the UN command. Initially they faced devastating losses. North Korean forces pushed them to the southeastern tip of the peninsula, but then came one of the boldest military maneuvers in modern history, General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing. The operation caught North Korea off guard, cutting its forces in two. Within weeks, UN troops had recaptured Seoul and driven deep into the north. Then, in late 1950, the war took another dramatic turn. The UN forces approached the Chinese border. China entered the war with massive troop reinforcements. The conflict escalated, turning into a brutal stalemate that would last 3 more years. By the time an armistice was signed in 1953, little had changed territorially. The border between North and South Korea remained near the 38th parallel. But politically and psychologically, the world had changed forever. The Korean War cost more than 2 million lives, including around 36,000 American soldiers. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and families were forever divided across one of the most militarized borders on Earth. For the United States, the Korean conflict reshaped Cold War policy. It confirmed that America was willing to use military force to contain communism, wherever it appeared. The war also accelerated the US military build-up and expanded defense budgets worldwide. Domestically, it reinforced public fear of communist infiltration and contributed to the rise of McCarthyism. In Asia, it led to a permanent US military presence, in Korea, Japan and beyond. Most importantly, the Korean War set a precedent for future US interventions, especially in Vietnam. It demonstrated how both the limits of American power and the high cost of fighting wars under the shadow of nuclear deterrence and ideological rivalry. So why did the United States intervene in the Korean War? At the core, it was about containment, trying to draw a line against communist expansion. But beyond that, it was about credibility, leadership, and maintaining a fragile balance in a divided world. Truman and his generation believed that Korea was the place where the free world had to stand firm. And though the war ended without victory, it shaped the course of the Cold War for decades to come and left a legacy that still defines the Korean Peninsula today. Even today, when tensions flare along the 38th parallel, the echoes of that 1950 decision can still be heard. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.